right, thank you to everyone who came out. Thank you for coming to my talk today and to the event in general. I'll be talking a little bit about the nuclear dimension of the Russian invasion and the current conflict that's going on. My name is Spencer Warren. I am a Ph.D. student in the Department of Political Science here at IU. Just a little brief outline about my talk. I'll be starting out with a discussion about Russia's nuclear capabilities and Russia's nuclear strategy, just to give a sense of what they have and how they generally envision using nuclear weapons in international politics. I will also discuss a bit about Russian nuclear signaling. Nuclear signaling has been a very significant part of the ongoing crisis, whether it's deploying weapons to Kaliningrad or raising the alert level of their nuclear forces. This is something that Russia has been doing both before the crisis and throughout the crisis. I'll also briefly talk a little bit about how the United States and NATO in general has responded to these signals, as well as how their response to the invasion is constrained or shaped by Russian nuclear capabilities and nuclear strategy. We'll also briefly talk about escalation risks. If there's a risk of the war escalating to a higher level, potentially to a nuclear level, what sort of things may increase that risk? And then we'll talk a little bit about nuclear weapons in Belarus. Belarus recently amended their constitution, which would allow them to be a host state for nuclear weapons, as well as talk a little bit about the history of Ukraine and nuclear weapons. And then if we have time at the end, I will discuss a little bit about nuclear energy in Ukraine and the risk of nuclear accidents coming from the war. We'll briefly mention Chernobyl, but also discuss other active nuclear reactors and the threats those might pose if there were to be some sort of accidental strike on the reactor themselves or an intentional strike on the reactor themselves. All right, to start. So Russia currently has the world's largest nuclear arsenal when you include its non-strategic nuclear weapons. When you look at just its strategic nuclear weapons, it rotates with the United States as being the largest nuclear arsenal. They both have roughly the same number of nuclear weapons. The New START Treaty limits both to the same number of strategic nuclear weapons, and as weapons are taken offline and new weapons are brought on to replace them, the United States and Russia alternate between being the largest and second largest strategic nuclear arsenal. But when you include the non-strategic weapons, Russia's the largest. Now, these weapons are largely outdated. However, they are being modernized as we speak. Russia has been pursuing nuclear modernization this phase roughly since the early 2000s, with a much more serious push in the 2010s as technology improved and as the Russian economy improved and there was more money to do so. This includes both upgrades to their current nuclear systems, as well as novel weapons that no country, not the United States, not China, not previously Russia or the Soviet Union, have developed or deployed. Some of these are now online, including the Avangard hypersonic missile or hypersonic glide vehicle, but some of these are still in the testing phase. Some of these weapons, one is a nuclear torpedo, one is a nuclear-powered cruise missile, honestly might never be developed because of technological and financial issues. But there are things that are potentially being developed. The main goal of Russia's nuclear arsenal is nuclear deterrence. Russia's arsenal is intended to deter either a nuclear attack or an overwhelming conventional attack that threatens the sovereignty, the survival of the regime, or the territorial integrity of the Russian Federation. These weapons are meant to prevent an attack on Russia by another actor, most likely the United States or NATO. However, it is possible in the future that these could be used to deter China as well. Now, Russia also envisions using nuclear weapons for what has been referred to in a lot of the academic literature as escalation management. Occasionally, this is referred to as escalate to de-escalate. The actual Russian strategic literature doesn't necessarily use either of these terms, but there is a broad consensus around a strategy that fits into what American and European scholars and analysts refer to as escalation management. This would entail using strategic forces, potentially nuclear or conventional, to launch a large and quick strike against NATO forces and American forces in the event that a war threatens to escalate. This is something that would be unlikely to happen in a local war or in a war that's focused on just one country in the post-Soviet region. But if this was to turn into a broader conflict that included NATO allies, this is something that is a real possibility of occurring. Now, the most likely targets of this strike would be US air bases in Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Turkey. Now, you may wonder why those 5 countries. That's because those 5 countries host US nuclear weapons at air bases. Another group of possible targets are US and French carrier groups. The United States and France have strategic aircraft that can carry nuclear weapons that can be deployed on aircraft carriers. So carrier groups operating in the Mediterranean, the North Atlantic, potentially the Arctic, would also be targets of such a strike. And finally, British and French submarine bases, because the British and French also have submarine-based nuclear weapons. There are other potential targets, especially any sort of large infantry, armor, or air divisions deployed in Eastern Europe that could be a threat to Russian forces in whatever theater they're fighting. But these are less likely to be targeted by nuclear, more likely to be targeted by conventional weapons, whereas these bases are more, or carrier groups, are more likely to be targeted by nuclear weapons. The goal of such a strike would be to prevent further escalation, which is something that seems very difficult to understand how that would work, given that this would be an incredibly escalatory strike. And another goal would be to quickly end the conflict on terms not necessarily favorable to Russia, but at least acceptable to Russia. The logic behind the strategy is that if you can impose high enough costs on your adversary, who you don't think would want to escalate to a total nuclear war, then you can immediately follow that up with efforts to de-escalate the crisis and to end the crisis quickly. This is a very dangerous strategy. This is a very, this is a very dangerous strategy. This is a strategy that would be, that many people, even in the Russian strategic community, consider to be wild, something that they don't consider to be a very wise strategy, and it's a very controversial strategy within Russia's strategic community. However, for the time being, the people who advocate for such a strategy appear to be winning in the formation of Russian strategy. So that's a little bit about their strategy and about their weapons. So what about their nuclear signaling? How do we see this playing out in the current crisis? Well, for nuclear deterrence, or for any kind of deterrence to work, you need both a clearly communicated threat and the capabilities to back it up. The previous slide showed the capabilities as well as the strategy of how they would use those capabilities to back up that threat. And nuclear signaling is how they get the clearly and credibly communicated threat. To start with, there have been overt threats made by Putin and Medvedev. They haven't necessarily said nuclear weapons would be used specifically. However, they have threatened things like retaliation and destruction that these countries have never seen before, which most people interpret as at least a threat of a threat of at least the possibility of nuclear use. There we go. Sorry about that. This is a little. There we go. All right. So at least the threat of at least the possibility of nuclear use. In addition to words, they've also taken certain actions that are clearly meant to communicate a potential threat, a potential nuclear threat. As I mentioned Russia has developed or is developing a number of nuclear weapons that no other state has ever developed, and that they have never developed before. One of these is an air-launched hypersonic cruise missile. This is called Kenjal, and it's already been deployed with Russian forces. Now this missile can be nuclear and it can be conventional, but its presence is generally considered to be a nuclear threat because of the potential of it being nuclear. Kenjal has been deployed on Russian fighters and bombers in Kaliningrad on February 8th, and it is believed to have been deployed to Syria on February 15th. From Kaliningrad, this could strike air bases in Germany, in much of Western Europe, potentially Italy. And from Syria, it could strike air bases in Turkey, air bases in Italy, as well as US or French carrier groups in the Mediterranean. These here are the weapons that you would expect to be used should there be a significant risk of escalation, and should Russia decide to use an escalation management strategy. Additionally, the crisis started at the height of their strategic nuclear forces exercises. This was not a coincidence. This was not an accident. This was intentionally done to threaten any country, any alliance that may consider intervening militarily. This here was less to show these countries of the potential capabilities of the weapons, but more to clearly communicate that they were willing to use them. And then on February 27th, as Western sanctions, Western military aid to Ukraine increased, Russia put its nuclear forces on high alert. Again, a signal that they were willing to potentially use nuclear weapons should the war escalate to a broader conflict. And the audience for all of these moves, all of these threats, is the United States and NATO. They want American leaders and our NATO allies in Europe and Canada to understand that they have these capabilities and they may be willing to use them if the war escalates. Now, it's not a foregone conclusion that they would. There is good reason to believe that they would, in fact, avoid nuclear escalation out of concerns that this could trigger a broader, cataclysmic, suicidal war. And as such, they would not want to do that. But there is also the possibility that they would. And Russian leaders know, whether they would or wouldn't actually use them, Russian leaders know that this ambiguity makes it so that these threats have to be taken seriously by Western policymakers.
May I stop you? Yeah. Just for a minute. What is Kenjal? What is it?
So Kenjal is one of the new weapons that they have developed.
Right.
It is an air-launched cruise missile it's an air-launched hypersonic cruise missile. So it's a missile that is launched from a fighter or a bomber. It can travel at speeds between 5 and 20 times the speed of light, or not light, speed of sound. Nothing can go as fast as the speed of light unless my physics is wrong, which is possible. And it is a type of missile. So there are basically two types of missiles. One is a ballistic missile that uses what's called a ballistic trajectory. You fire it, and it follows an arc, roughly. Cruise missiles follow a different trajectory. Both missiles are very common in both Russia and the US and elsewhere. But what's new about this one is its speed. No missile previously would maintain that speed over its entire flight. Most missiles do actually hit that speed as they approach their target, just because of the force of gravity pulling them down faster and faster, but none of them maintain that speed over their entire flight. So this was the first one that did that. And then the second one is also a Russian missile, or a Russian glide vehicle, which is slightly different, but is very similar. So yeah, of course. So how has the United States and NATO responded? Well, the United States specifically, as the main nuclear power in NATO, not the only nuclear power in NATO, Britain and France also have nuclear weapons, but the United States has the majority of them. The United States, nor any of its other nuclear armed allies, did not increase their own nuclear alert levels. The United States also postponed pre-planned missile tests. The reasoning for this is the United States is intentionally trying to de-escalate the conflict, at least on its nuclear dimension. The United States and NATO, according to the words of John Kirby, the spokesperson of the US Department of Defense, is trying to show that we are the responsible nuclear power. That it's Russia who is being reckless, it's Russia who's being irresponsible. We're taking concrete action to reduce the threat of a nuclear war. We're taking concrete action to try to keep this from even reaching the nuclear brink. It's not there yet, and it's really not close. But we're going to do what we can to keep it from getting closer. This is considered to be a de-escalatory response. Now, it's probably something that's going to get a lot of criticism from more hawkish elements in the United States and in Western Europe. But this is also something that has gotten a lot of support from other elements within the United States and Western Europe as a move that doesn't really degrade America's capability to respond to any Russian escalation, while also showing that the United States doesn't want escalation and wants to bring the severity of the nuclear threats down. Now, this has also impacted our conventional response to the crisis. The United States, NATO, have not deployed ground troops to Ukraine. We have not implemented a no-fly zone. Many people have called for that for many reasons. The main reason we haven't done that is concern that doing so would lead us into a broader conflict with Russia, and that doing so has serious risks of nuclear escalation, as has been because of these signals from Russia about the possible use of nuclear weapons. So Russian nuclear capabilities and nuclear signaling constrains the ability of other actors to respond, especially other nuclear-armed actors. So what about these escalation risks? I've mentioned this a few times already. Well, in general, the escalation risks currently remain low. The likelihood of nuclear use is, at the moment, in my assessment, at or near zero in the conflict as it currently stands. Now, that doesn't mean that can't change. There have been times where conflicts escalate and de-escalate. They move up. The chance of nuclear use gets much more likely, or the chance of nuclear use starts high and then decreases. So what might cause some of these changes in the level of escalation risk? Well, the most obvious one would be direct NATO or US involvement. This would greatly increase the risk of this escalating to a nuclear conflict. The second would be a NATO or US response to Russia's nuclear alert status changes that could be misinterpreted by Russian policymakers as an escalatory move rather than as a response, something that unfortunately happens in international politics quite a bit. Not necessarily with nuclear alert changes, because this is something that's very rare. Another thing would be if Russia deployed nuclear weapons to Belarus. We'll talk a bit about it either the next slide or the slide after, but there's a possibility that Russia could now deploy weapons to Belarus. I don't suspect that Russia would have really cared too much about local Belarusian law if the crisis demanded, in their view, a nuclear deployment. But Belarus, including in their new constitution, no provision to prevent this, does make it more likely, in my view. And then another possibility is accidental attacks on neutral country flagged ships. This has happened a couple of times. In one instance, an instance that clearly shows that this was a case of misidentification, one of the ships they attacked was operating under the flag of a country that Russia is actively trying to court, Moldova, and the individuals who were injured were all Russian citizens. While there may be, of course, times where attacks on these ships aren't necessarily accidental, the fact that this was that particular country and the citizens were Russian tells me that this was not an intentional strike on a civilian neutral ship. Luckily, these haven't caused any serious increases in escalation. And out of all of these others, it's probably the one that would be the least likely to do so. Another thing to keep in mind is that the longer the duration of the conflict, the greater the risk of escalation, simply because there's more time for accidents to happen. There's also more time, or there's also, the longer the conflict goes, that also puts greater strain on the Russian government and on Vladimir Putin, and may make him more likely to use nuclear weapons. It may make him more likely to take actions that we may not consider rational. There are also some aspects of this current nuclear crisis that we can see as wild cards when trying to assess escalation risk, because they're not necessarily things we see in that we see in past nuclear crises. For one, the level of domestic political pressure and its escalation throughout the crisis at least appears to be higher than the pressures placed on leaders in previous nuclear crises. This could impact the rationality and the decision-making capabilities of Vladimir Putin and other Russian leaders. It also might not. Yes?
So I don't know what you mean domestic political. We're talking about who's the domestic?
In this case, we're talking about the domestic pressures within Russia. So at the moment, it would be things like the increase in protests in Russia, as well as the potential for greater political pressure in the coming weeks and months, which also contributes to the longer duration of conflict leading to greater risk. Because as the conflict goes on, there'll be greater domestic pressures. Other leaders have faced domestic pressures before, but not quite to this extent that we know of. It's also possible that in previous crises in countries that were less open, that there was this level of domestic pressure, but we just didn't see it or haven't really appreciated it to the extent we do now. There's a possibility that our assessments and my assessment of domestic political pressures could be skewed by available data, also possibly by recency. And so we might not be actually correct on saying that there's more political pressure than in past events. Another thing that's fairly new is the increasing economic and diplomatic isolation. Again, North Korea has been involved in nuclear crises. They're still more economically and diplomatically isolated than Russia is, but the sharp increase in economic sanctions, the sharp increase in diplomatic isolation that occurred within the crisis itself is something that is fairly new. So this is something that we're not fully sure how that plays out and if that actually factors into the decision-making of any particular individual or people in general. And finally, this one has a little bit of an asterisk. The proximity to a nuclear armed state, Ukraine's proximity to a nuclear armed state. There have been concerns about the possibility that nuclear weapons may not be used against NATO, but potentially within Ukraine itself. This is something that remains incredibly, incredibly unlikely. There have been considerations of possible nuclear use in other crises featuring other states, whether it's the United States or the Soviet Union against a non-nuclear state, and so far the only use has been in Japan. Since then, there hasn't been nuclear use. Different reasons it may exist for this. There have been debates about whether it's some sort of taboo against the use of nuclear weapons, sort of a logic of appropriateness argument that it's just inappropriate for states to do so. Some of it could also be a logic of consequences argument, that this lowers the threshold for future use, potentially against your own allies or against you, and that this makes the risk of escalation greater. However, in none of these cases have we really seen two states that were this geographically close? And this might factor in two ways. One is that Ukraine, to Vladimir Putin, is more important to Vladimir Putin than, say, Afghanistan was to Andropov, Brezhnev, Gorbachev, than Vietnam was to Johnson or Nixon. And so that might change his calculation. But the other thing is that any sort of use would inherently negatively affect Russian territory because it is so close. And so if you look at so even if the logic of appropriateness isn't acting as a constraint, the logic of consequences still acts as a fairly significant constraint against any kind of use. And again, the risk is incredibly low, and I would say is near zero or at zero in this case. But these are wild cards that we really don't know exactly how they play out, and it's going to take some time for us to understand fully how they played out. Here we go. As I mentioned a couple of times, Belarus passed a constitutional referendum this past Sunday. Up until then, Belarus was officially a nuclear-free state between the mid-90s and February 27th of this year. Belarus had previously had nuclear weapons, as Ukraine and Kazakhstan did. They gave them up to Russia, both because they didn't want them and also because there was significant pressure from Russia and the United States to do so. And after they got rid of those nuclear weapons, they were a nuclear-free state officially in their constitution until February 27th. The new constitution does not include the nuclear-free provision. What does this mean? Well, this means that Belarus could try to develop their own nuclear weapons, but that's not something that they're going to try to do. They don't need them. It's a waste of resources for them. It doesn't give them any kind of additional benefit. However, it would allow the deployment of Russian weapons on Belarusian soil. Now, this would most likely be a response to either the development of indigenous nuclear capabilities in other parts of Europe, something I think is a risk that is still fairly low, or the deployment of US nuclear weapons in an Eastern European country, especially Poland. But this could also be done during the crisis as a way to try to coerce NATO or Ukraine into certain actions using nuclear coercion, basically using overt threats to try to force NATO or Ukraine to accept some kind of settlement or make some kind of action. Now, luckily for NATO and Ukraine, nuclear coercion actually has a fairly bad track record of working. There are cases when it does, but recent research in political science has found that it's a very ineffective tool, and the other forms of coercion are better. And finally, if they were to deploy nuclear weapons, this could either, if Russia was to deploy nuclear weapons in Belarus, this would either risk escalating the current crisis. This is one of the things I mentioned could be a risk for greater escalation, or it could potentially cause a different crisis. If this were to happen, say 2-3 years from now, we could have another crisis where we could basically, in the late 70s, early 80s, to the mid 80s, there was the Euro missile crisis. This is something that could potentially trigger something similar to that, where then the Soviets had deployed a new nuclear weapon system, the United States responded, and it created a potential for escalation of the arms race in Europe. This is something that could do something similar if Russia deploys weapons in Belarus, and the United States responds by deploying weapons in, say, Poland or Romania. So this is something that could potentially cause another crisis later on. All right, now something that's been talked about quite a lot in this crisis is the fact that Ukraine once had nuclear weapons. And there's a question about would this have changed the crisis? Would this have changed relations with Russia, the United States, so on and so forth? So I'm going to attempt to answer that here in this slide. When the Soviet Union collapsed, not only Russia, but also Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan had nuclear weapons on their soil. Technically, these weapons were under at least nominal control of the governments of Belarus, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Russia. Because so many weapons were on Ukraine soil, they would have technically had the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, larger than France at the time. However, in 1994, Ukraine agreed to transfer these weapons back to Russia. The United States had very heavily pressured all three non-Russian governments to transfer their weapons back to Russia, where they would eventually be destroyed or incorporated into Russia's arsenal within limits of existing arms control treaties. The main reason for this was the two main reasons for this were one, the United States only wanted to deal with one nuclear-armed post-Soviet state, not four. And two, the United States wanted to reduce the risk of nuclear technology being transferred to other states or nuclear material falling into the hands of criminal groups or terrorist organizations. Ukraine agreed to this in 1994. They also received assurances of security and sovereignty from Britain, the United States, and Russia in the Budapest Memorandum. As we can see, that really hasn't been a very effective agreement, at least from the Ukrainian side. And by 1998, these weapons had been transferred to Russia. It took several years to work out the logistics. There were debates over certain strategic bombers that Ukraine claimed they had a right to, even though they were nuclear capable, because they could also be used for conventional weapons and weren't inherently nuclear. But by 1998, late 1998, this process has worked its way out.
Could I say
Yes.
something? I'm sorry, okay, I'm a Democrat. The great Republican Senator Richard Lugar was key in the discussions about, getting this nuclear stuff corral.
Yes.
I wanted to say that.
Richard Lugar, both in getting the three non-Russian countries to transfer weapons back to Russia, as well as creating funding and programs to protect nuclear material in the former Soviet Union and to recover or find lost nuclear material from the former Soviet Union was one of the best leaders we had for that. The people I worked with in undergrad worked very closely with him because he was a former DoD official. But yeah, so Richard Lugar, the school that we're in, very important figure for this. But this return created the debate, as I mentioned, should Ukraine have kept nuclear weapons? Now, people who argue that Ukraine should have basically argue that this crisis was a whole lot less likely to happen and may have never happened. People who argue against it argue that this crisis still could have happened, as we see with India and Pakistan, and India and China having frequent crises over the last 10 years. And that would have made this crisis incredibly more dangerous, because now you have two nuclear-armed states, plus a nuclear-armed third player in the United States and its NATO allies, all of whom could possibly face pressures for nuclear first use, all of whom could make miscalculations, all of whom could be involved in an accidental escalation. But there's another issue. There's the issue of if Ukraine could have actually kept their nuclear weapons and actually been able to use them. There are two main problems with Ukraine being able to have kept their nuclear weapons. One of these was logistical. The codes themselves were housed in Moscow for the whole time. Now, this is something that could have been overcome. Plenty of experts that I've read, including people who worked with Senator Lugar on non-proliferation issues, believe that Ukrainian engineers had the technical capability, the technical knowledge necessary to change the codes in Ukraine and grant Ukraine access to the weapons. So these are something that could have been overcome. However, there would have also been financial issues that almost certainly would not have been able to be overcome. Even in the 90s, these weapons were in terrible shape. The Soviet Union had decided to start modernizing their arsenal again in the late 80s to replace aging technology, but the collapse of the Soviet Union and significant financial pressures before the collapse prevented them from really doing anything. So these weapons were in awful shape and needed immediate maintenance and would very quickly need modernization. That's an incredibly expensive thing to do. Ukraine almost certainly would not have been able to afford it, especially given that much of Ukraine's trade, which came from European countries or Russia, would likely not have happened because Ukraine would have most likely become a pariah state for refusing to give up their nuclear weapons, leading to international sanctions, at least from the United States, as well as other European countries. And so this is something that would have probably eventually led to Ukraine giving up the weapons themselves, or at least making it difficult for them to actually be functional. So this is another aspect of the debate that that people often don't consider. Now, as I mentioned, if we had time, I would talk a little bit about the potential for nuclear accidents in the war. But a little bit before we started talking, for those of you who were here, I was talking a little bit about Chernobyl and about Russia taking over the Chernobyl nuclear site. This is something that made international news when it happened because of people's fear of what could happen to Chernobyl or what could happen in Chernobyl. Most technical experts that I've read believe that cracking the protective case around the nuclear material would require some form of deliberate action. Russia would have to intentionally hit the sarcophagus that houses the material with artillery, with rockets, in order to crack it and create a crisis. Now, the logic of appropriateness of doing this may not be a constraint. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But the logic of consequences is very much a constraint on such an action. Because the majority of the radioactive fallout would hit Belarus, and much of the rest would hit European Russia. This would have enormous costs for very limited strategic benefit if that was done. This is something that would be costlier, that would be too costly of an action for even the most depraved mind to do, because it's something that would hurt them more. Now, what about issues beyond Chernobyl? Ukraine has several other nuclear reactors that are active. And unlike Chernobyl, they don't have this massive protective layer protecting the potentially dangerous materials. What protections they do have could be destroyed much more easily. And most experts believe that these could actually be damaged or possibly destroyed by accident. If artillery fire meant to hit something 100 yards away, hit the reactor itself. Now, what makes this particularly dangerous is that even if, again, Russia may not want to hit the reactors themselves because of the impact it would have on European Russia, as well as on Belarus, there are areas near the reactors that are likely to be targets, either because they're critical civilian infrastructure, or because they're military sites. And so this is an accident that could potentially happen and have very dangerous consequences. All right, and so with that, I believe I'm done with my side of the talk. I'm happy to answer any questions here, any comments that anyone might have. Yes?
Spenser, there's one escalatory scenario that you did not include, and that is either intentional or unintentional incursion into military territory by the
yes.
Russians. And that is very largely dependent on what Putin wants to achieve in the current crisis. So, I mean, and not just what we see in the news, the Baltic states of Poland, but there are two other neighboring NATO states, Slovakia and Hungary, and Romania.
In Romania.
So what is your view on that?
All right, so that is something I did forget to mention. Is there's a possibility of an intentional or accidental incursion into a NATO allied state, whether it be Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, or Romania. This is something that is a possibility. I think it appears less likely. There was an accidentally leaked photo of an invasion plan from Lukashenko. And that invasion plan largely ignored the western part of Ukraine. So if that invasion plan is followed, then this is something I think that would be likely avoided. However, there are two caveats to that. One, Maybe this wasn't accidentally leaked. Maybe this is intentionally leaked and was false. And two is maybe this is the real plan, but situations on the ground require or result in the plan being changed. If that happens, I think there is a greater risk of doing so. And what could potentially make that more dangerous is that it's not only the motivations of Putin that could cause this, but now in addition to him, you also have the motivations and competencies of local commanders. If division level, even if Putin and all the leaders in the Kremlin don't want to do this because they're worried about escalation, local level commanders may want to do it. They may want to do it to pursue some unit that they believe has crossed into NATO territory, or they may not want to do it and accidentally cross into NATO territory out of incompetence. So you could have. So this is something that could be particularly dangerous as well. Yes.
On February 27th, when Putin announced that he was putting the strategic deterrence forces on alert, I thought it was interesting that he didn't specifically use the word nuclear at all in that exchange.
Yes.
What do you make of that? Do you think there's a reason that they're not saying explicitly nuclear, they're saying strategic deterrence forces, they're saying more damage than is imaginable, euphemisms like that? Do you think there's a reason for that?
I think there is a reason for that. I think there's possibly two reasons. First is they don't want to box themselves in with saying they will use nuclear capabilities. If they get to a point where they believe they need to escalate and think they can accomplish their goals with non-nuclear strategic weapons. Another issue is that I think this points to this trying to be this points to trying to be a deterrent. They're trying to find a way to convey these threats to American and European leaders in a way that makes them aware that nuclear use is a possibility, but in a way that isn't so escalatory that it leads to such a strong U.S. or NATO response that it risks escalating beyond the level they want to escalate to. So I think it could be one, trying not to box themselves into a specific strategy if they decide they do want to escalate, and two, trying to control the level of escalation. Any others?
So anyone were to ask you, as an expert, what is the likelihood that this crisis escalates geographically, in terms of the level of conflict, from conventional to tactical, from tactical to intermediate, from intermediate to a strategic exchange, what would you say? These are all different scenarios, of course.
My assessment is that the likelihood of escalating geographically and then from conventional to the tactical or beyond are both incredibly low. But when you're dealing with something as dangerous as nuclear weapons, incredibly low is still too high to be comfortable. So it's something I do believe that leaders around the world should be concerned about, and they should be cautious about how they respond to certain things. But it's not. I don't think that it's not something that I would expect to be a very high risk. It's something that is certainly possible, even if it's very unlikely, and that should be kind of concerning to people, and is something that we should try to avoid. But I think it's very unlikely, but still not unlikely enough to be comfortable. Which is probably not the greatest answer that people want, but yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I've read that, like in previous strategy documents about nuclear deterrence in the Russian Federation, they talked about how the nuclear deterrence is kind of supposed to make up for a bit of a reduced strength in conventional forces, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Do you think that still plays a role in this crisis? I mean, we've seen a lot of reports about like tanks breaking down, the equipment being very faulty and malfunctioning. Is that still? I read about this in like the 2000 nuclear document, and to an extent in 2010 as well. Do do you think that an increased reliance on nuclear deterrence in lieu of weakened conventional forces is still a significant factor in today's Russian military?
I do think it is. I think it's, at least at the start of the crisis, was less of a factor than it was in, say, 2010, because there has been significant modernization of conventional capabilities. But I do still think it's important, because unlike, sort of like the reverse of the Cold War, where NATO Europe had at least numerical inferiority in Europe, Russia has an inferior conventional capability, even with the significant improvements that they've made in technology. And I think that this is something that is now even more apparent given the significant issues that their conventional forces have had, especially when it comes to things like preparation of troops and leadership at lower levels of command, where they have shown to be incredibly lacking. So I do think that this is still a very significant part of Russian thought. If it was just conventional capabilities, the Russian leadership, at least in my view, believes that they would not be able to deter significant aggression from the United States or NATO today, or potentially China 10 years from now. So I think that this is still something that is very ingrained in Russian thought, and something that's going to continue to be a major factor in Russian strategic thought.
So, Spencer, so what we think done, remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, and what did the trick was removal of the Jupiters from Turkey. So what is the Jupiter for now, in your estimation?
The Jupiter for now.
So what can you offer Putin, the Russians, to consider backing down, while saving face?
All saving face.
Because it's very difficult for them to back down now without a face-saving measure.
From the that's tough. I think especially because I think some of the things that we could offer are things that are things that we would not want to offer to end the crisis. One possibility would be offering would be either say offering recognition of Crimea, or a plan to, or a concrete legal document that would prevent further NATO expansion. I don't think either of those were actually the primary motivations of Putin, but I think that's a way that he could save face. The issue with that is there are significant strategic reasons to not want to do those things, significant domestic political things in the US and elsewhere not to do those things, and there are also I think some moral imperatives to not do those kind of things. So these will all be very costly for the United States, for NATO, and especially for Ukraine. So I think that might make this an even more dangerous situation in the long run. Is that what could function as the Jupiters are simply much more important to the security and sovereignty of Ukraine, as well as the security and sovereignty of Europe, than the Jupiters were. So. Well, I think that was it. Well, thank you very much.